I'm particularly delighted to welcome the money-saving expert, Martin Lewis, OBE, and Rabbi Shlomo Levin from South Hampstead Synagogue, where Martin is a member. We also welcome Martin's father, Stuart, and wife, Lara. Over the last several years, Martin has become a household name and a welcome contributor to many of our homes through his blogs and website, his insight and explanations. He reaches millions and saves us millions, possibly billions. Check out moneysavingexpert.com and ITV's Martin Lewis Money Show. I'm going to have an introductory chat with Martin and then hand over to Rabbi Levin to moderate your questions. Please do bear in mind that Martin cannot give specific personal financial or pension advice in this forum. Please do submit your questions from now and at any time through the chat. I would like to thank Shimon Gillis for setting up the event and for running the tech this evening. Welcome all. Martin Lewis, good evening.
Hello.
In January 2019, the Guardian newspaper described you as the most trusted man in Britain. I think the most trusted woman was the Queen. What does it mean to carry that kind of values-loaded accolade?
It's both flattering, but continues to drive one of my absolute core attributes that got me to where I am, which is professional paranoia. I have always, from the beginning of my career, been paranoid to try not just to do the right thing, but also never to do anything that could be perceived as being the wrong thing. And it is, I take this to a very fine degree. And since being called in that survey and others, you know, the most trusted person in the country, actually, it just ramps on top. There's enormous value. Some people will be working businesses out there. I suppose that trust dividend is ultimately the goodwill in what I do, and the goodwill in Money Saving Expert is because people take it without question at face value. It's the same reason why my face is the most financially scammed in the country, with scammers using adverts or people knocking on doors claiming that I sent them. Those are terrible backhanded compliments and things I fight, because ultimately, you know, both in its own right, those scammers are horrendous and are trying to do evil things to vulnerable people, but also because the brand and the hard work I've done all over the years is degraded by people taking my name and using it to scam. But if I go, I'll give you an example of that paranoia, just to show you how it works. So my website always writes what's in the consumer's best interest. As a matter of course, it's protected in the editorial code when I sold it and was always acted that way. That is always in the first instance, what is right for our readers ahead of any financial considerations. But we do, when a product is good, we will get a link that means we get a contribution from that company if someone gets the product, as long as it doesn't make it more expensive for them and as long as it isn't available cheaper elsewhere. I remember one time there was a broadband deal. And that broadband deal that we had arranged had two elements. It had an automatic cashback to it, which was the blagged bit for my website. And that was on top of a standard deal that gave you I think it was something like a £50 prepaid MasterCard as well, that you had to claim. Now, I happened to find out as we were writing this up, it was best deal on the market. You factor that in, it was superbly cheap. Someone mentioned to me in passing that if people didn't claim the prepaid MasterCard, which wasn't part of the deal we was arranged, we were just piggybacking on top of that, then actually my site would get the money if people hadn't claimed it. We would get the same value. So therefore, there was a benefit to MSE of people getting this deal, getting the automatic cashback we had arranged, but not getting the prepaid MasterCard. When I heard this, I went to the commercial team and said, you need to say, it might not have been BT. I should also check that carefully. It was a firm. It might have been one of the others. Doesn't matter. We'll call it BT totemically. I went back and said, we have two choices. Either we don't do the deal because we cannot risk anyone thinking that we have that perverse incentive, or we need to change the contract that if people don't do the claim, and we'll push them to do the claim as much as possible, we don't get the money. Now, the likelihood of anybody ever finding out how that deal operated, even though it was the best deal on the market and it was absolutely right for people, was completely negligible. But professional paranoia, one of my greatest weapons, meant I would not accept it. I couldn't go to sleep knowing we'd done it that way because someone, if it ever came out, might have been able to put a question in on why did you do it that way? So it's not just being seen to do the right thing. It's making sure there's no way you could be seen to do the wrong thing, even if you are doing the right thing.
Wow, this is the stuff that religious Musa books are written about. I'm intrigued because you were Secretary General of the LSE Student Union and considered at some point a career in politics, and politics and government was your degree. How could you have maintained that whiter than white ethical, political, or personal integrity paranoia if you'd gone into politics?
I couldn't. And it's one of the reasons I say now I would never get involved in partisan politics.
Right, but you are a political animal.
Of course, political with a small p. My job, whether it's campaigning for people to get bank charges back or PPI or council tax or the severe mental impairment discounts, or as I'm doing at the moment, campaigning for the excluded group, all of that's innately political. Innately political. I just won't do the party politics because as soon as you accept a whip is by definition compromise. It says, I will subjugate my own personal beliefs for the greater good of the cause of which I'm relating or the party of which I'm engaged in. So you would have an immediate sacrifice. And I also think it's interesting because often they do polls, who do you want to be Chancellor or Prime Minister? And I do quite well in those as well. I've come top of those on occasion. And I think what's interesting about that is I always say to people, the problem is if I did get that, I would soon be as hated as other politicians afterwards, because a politician's job is to balance vested interests. It's very easy. I'm completely biased in my work towards the consumer. In fact, it's interesting because I'm a journalist and I'm proudly a journalist, but I am a biased journalist. And I think impartiality in journalism is somewhat overrated. It's very difficult to do. I don't attempt it. I'm a partial biased journalist. I use the phrase campaigning journalist to indicate that. I will campaign. But the key to being a good biased journalist is to make sure that your bias is overt and declared so everybody knows what you stand for. And in my case, that's pro-consumer. But you can't do that as a politician because we don't have single interest politicians who can simply represent one view. What we have is they all have to be broad church or broad synagogue, as we're talking here tonight, either way you like it. And that means actually you are always compromised, especially in our hideous adversarial political system where we have an opposition. Isn't it awful? We have a political system that has an opposition. Someone's job is to oppose. I always wonder whether that's particularly constructive for a good, adequate democracy, to have someone whose sole job is to oppose you in whatever the government, in whatever they say, as opposed to going, that bit's good, that bit's bad.
So when did you decide to become a journalist?
I went to journalism school in 1997. I'd worked in the city in financial PR before that, and I'd been in student politics before that. Financial PR was a great job to have had. I appreciated it, but I was on the wrong side. And I intuitively always felt that I was doing the wrong thing on the wrong side. It wasn't for me. It's a good job for many people. It didn't fit in my natural ethos. So I went to Cardiff to do a postgraduate in broadcast journalism, which was a wonderful year where I had a fantastic time and made an awfully large number of mistakes, which thankfully, as long as my fellow students on the course never reveal any tapes that they've got of them, no one will ever hear.
So are you in the kind of journalism you wanted to do at the time?
I wasn't sure. I mean, I think at the time I was struck by, I quite had a nice inkling that I wanted to be famous, which is, let me tell you, anyone who gets to that position, you soon regret it. And I never thought I'd be famous through money, but it was a very obvious route. After the year, I suddenly realized I had this fantastic contacts book. And so I went straight to the BBC Business Unit, which wasn't right for me. But after a year there, I started to get engaged in personal finance. And I'm always interested in the personal, not the public finances, the practical, not the political. And that was really where I started to realize that for me, what turned me on was looking at how you can enable people, and as a journalist helping people in their lives. And it's really interesting because journalism gets a terrible shtick as a trade. And actually, done right, journalism is so powerful. I mean, let's look at the contrast. One of the least trusted professions, but you mentioned before the stat about me. I am a journalist, loudly and proudly. I'm not a financial advisor. And the work I do is specialist investigative journalism into consumer finance products.
So your approach is sometimes quite confrontational. And you talk about an adversarial consumer society. In one of your broadcasts, you called for a revolution to put 30% back in people's pockets. I mean, what does that mean, a revolution and an adversarial consumer society?
Well, I do believe we have an adversarial consumer society. A company's job is to make money. A consumer's job is to keep the money in their pocket. And that is adversarial. The best way I can describe it, though, is I'm a Manchester City fan. When Man City play Manchester United, I don't think Manchester United are wrong for trying to score. I just know that my job is to try and stop them doing it, or the City's job is to try and stop them doing it, to get the analogy right. And the same is true of that relationship between companies and individuals. And actually, we are starting to move, and I wonder whether I have to change that towards more of corporate response. For a long time, we've had this corporate social responsibility, which I think is a load of balderdash, which is a proxy word for another B one I want to say, but I've got two rabbis on the call, so I won't say it. Because I often think it's just moral whitewashing. Companies are there to make money for their shareholders. And when we try and impart a sort of social or moral value on them, we actually tend to get confused and it gets difficult. But I think in the last couple of years, the world has started to change. And that may be no longer true. As long as shareholder value is has primacy, then I think you always have to be skeptical about the attitude of companies in what they do. But as we move away and we're starting to hear the language that shareholder value is no longer at the forefront in every company, I think a change is possible. So I do think it is adversarial. And in fact, in the early days of MSC, the motto was, and if anyone has slightly sensitive ears to language, I apologize, but we did publish it. A company's job is to screw you for cash. Our job is to show you how to screw them back. And that was the early motto. It's since changed for a number of reasons. One, because we've gone more mainstream. But two, because actually campaigning became part of the blood after about 3 or 4 years. Especially mental health was the first big thing I got involved in. And so the motto since 2005 has been cutting your bills, fighting your corner. So it still has a bit of punchiness in, but it's actually far more about financial justice now than the far more selfish, mercenary, it's us versus them. And actually, some of that is my own attitude change that's driven that. I was very much a purist in the early days.
How do you come up with money saving expert as the title, MSE, and what's the balance between stinginess and prudence?
Well, money saving expert, actually, I came up with while I worked at a channel called Simply Money. I'd been the business correspondent. I started the deal of the day slot and we needed your new title. And we sat around, and money saving expert I came up with after a bit of a while, because it sort of seemed to describe it. There's a sort of slight complication about the word saving, because some people say it's money savings expert and they think it's about savings, where it's not. It's about value driven in whatever you do. Now, interestingly, we have a forum on the site called Money Saving Old Style. And Money Saving Old Style is about thrift. And thrift is useful, but that isn't what I do. There are many people better at thrift than me. Thrift, I would define as saving money by spending your time. I'm gonna clean my whole house with white vinegar and take a lot longer. I'm gonna make everything myself. A good old World War II style rationing way of living. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's very efficient, but it's not my expertise. Money saving new style for me is about playing the system, understanding how things work, being financially savvy and educated, spotting loopholes and making it work for you. Now, within that, there's a confusion that I'm about tightness. I fundamentally reject that notion. My entire aim is about increasing well-being and happiness for people. Stop spending money on the things that you get no gain from. Don't pay 1,200 quid on your energy bills when you could get exactly the same gas, same electricity, same safety for £950. You've then got 250 quid. Now, if you've got savings, you've got money, you can choose to go and spend that on something you'll enjoy. Just don't pay more than you need to for it, or give it to charity. Just don't pay, make sure you do it the most efficient way and add your gift aid on top, or however you're doing it. So it's about being efficient, but equally, lack of money is one of the great causes of misery. So if you're in debt, if you're short of money, then saving money then is about being frugal, is about reducing the debt, is about learning to sleep at night. But some confuse the language I talk to for those who are struggling with money to be a philosophy, but the big philosophy is to increase your happiness. And happiness for people who have got money comes from having a bit more to spend on the things you want. And happiness for those who don't have money comes from getting rid of the misery and getting yourself out of debt and letting you sleep at night. So I don't think it's about tightness, but tightness has a place.
So it's just sort of a tangent from stinginess. You've described yourself as a secular person with a Jewish bit on my side. Is there a Jewish dimension to your financial values?
I think we have to be very careful on this one, right? Because I'm always, obviously within this audience, it would be easy to wax lyrical on that. But let's be very careful, and let me give you an alternative way of asking the same question you've just asked me. Are you a money-saving expert because you're Jewish? And now you see the danger, and now you see the trap. And that's a trap I don't ever want to fall in, which is why my public line, even to a synagogue crowd, is I'm a money-saving expert and I'm Jewish. I'm not a money-saving expert because I'm Jewish. Now, if you ask me, are some of my own personal values Jewish driven, the idea that I give to charity, which is very important with me? Absolutely. Is there a moral component to the life that I live? And does some of that stem, not all of it, some of that stem from a religious belief? Absolutely. But is the fact I'm good at saving money because of my religion? No way, no how, nothing at all to do with it. And anybody who says it is getting close to anti-Semitism. So I think we need to be very careful to stay away from those tropes. And I've had them. I even had it once on air in television. I won't mention who. Someone who mentioned, says, oh, just like a good Jewish little boy. And, so you will forgive me, Rabbi, but I think as you're recording this and as we're on the record, the answer to your question has to be no.
I'm going to applaud that answer. Despite recording it and on the record, I think that was a really, really beautiful answer. And coming out of Corona, and you interviewed Rishi Sunak just after the budget and asked him some good questions about what he was doing. But are we going to be paying for COVID for the next 100 years? As we try to rebuild, what should we as families be doing?
We might be paying for COVID for the next 100 years, but whether it affects our life or not, I will leave that to an economist rather than a money-saving expert. I know my discipline. I'm not an economist. That's macroeconomics. I'm about the personal, not the public finances. And of course, I'm caught at the moment. Many of you will be aware, I'm sure it's a sophisticated audience listening, of what's called the paradox of thrift, right? The absolutely correct thing for an individual to be doing in a moment of crisis like this is to batten down the personal hatches, make sure that you've got a good store of finances to look after yourself and your family. Don't spend too much so that if anything happens, and we are in a period of unprecedented uncertainty like we've never had before with Brexit and with coronavirus on top, the only thing that is certain right now is the uncertainty. And all of that means the individual should absolutely be thrifty, have a good store of savings and able to protect themselves in the future. But the worst thing for our economy is for people not to be spending money right now, because what the economy needs is us all to go out there and spend. And so that is the paradox of thrift definition. And I have had some moral moments over the last year thinking, how do I wrestle and rescue with this one as someone who's clearly my agenda is saving people money? How do I get around that? Now, in the early days of the pandemic, the word I came up with it was forbearance. And I spoke a lot on television about forbearance. The simple idea that if your local theatre's saying, please don't take a refund, take vouchers, and you're thinking, yeah, but I could do with the cash. Well, if you need the cash, take the cash. But if you don't need the cash and you want to protect your local theatre, then take the voucher. Forbearance. Understand that, for companies and even for governments, in the beginning of that pandemic, we just had to be a bit kinder towards each other and a bit more conscientious about the impact that our decisions over our cash had for everyone else. I think in some respects that moment has gone in the public consciousness, not in mine. I would urge those who have money to spend and can spend without impacting their future lifestyle in a detrimental way, well, it's a good time to go and spend. And we've been doing more takeaways than we've ever done before during this, because I wanted to help support our local restaurants, and we can afford it very comfortably. All good ones, don't worry, including the old delicatessen up the road from us. So, doing all that type of thing, I think is important. But ultimately, our first responsibility is to protect our families. I use the analogy that finance is a bit like, it's a bit like you're on the airplane and they give you that instruction. Ladies and gentlemen, in the event of cabin decompression, masks will fall from the ceiling. We would advise parents, please put your own mask on before you put your child's mask on. Because if you can't breathe, you can't look after your child. And if you can't support your family financially, you can't look after the economy. So once your own mask is on, your financial mask is on, I would suggest after that point, and you're breathing freely and everything is fine, then you think about the economy.
I'd just like to remind people if they could send questions in through the chat. One of the things that is clearly dear to your heart, you set up the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute in 2016. Now you talk about breaking a vicious cycle of money and mental health problems. What is that?
Well, I'll just give you two stats, and these two stats are incredibly telling. And money and mental health, I'm very proud of it, that I never wanted to set up another business after Money Saving Expert because I never considered it a business. But money and mental health, we have 13 full-time staff. It's changed 30 or 40 different government policies and regulators, and now audits companies for their mental health stances, and has, helped many people and saved many lives. So I'm very proud of the Institute, and I'm still chair of it and still fund it. Let me give you the two stats then. You are 4 times more likely to be in crisis debt if you have or your partner has a mental health condition than everybody else. 4 times. The clinical treatment time for depression, clinical depression, and this stat is less firmed up, but is indicative, is estimated to be 18 months longer for someone who has a financial problem, a substantial financial problem, than for anybody else. So this is a chicken and egg situation. We know that mental health problems can cause financial issues. We know financial issues can cause mental health problems. And what happened when we started investigating this, and I've been fascinated by it for, I told you, since 2005. But once I had the freedom and finances to be able to do something about it, I set up the Institute. Not to deal with individuals, because there's not enough money in the world to be able to do that. What we have to do is change policy. And once I got this brilliant team of economists and analysts and policy experts working on it, do you know whose fault it was? Do you know whose fault the problem in the system was? No one's. There isn't actually a bad guy or gal here. It just wasn't considered. The structure is wrong. There were structural problems that what we did is we set up systems before we knew as much about mental health. We didn't consider mental health, and we didn't look at those people. Now, I'll just give you a stat that's really challenging in the future. I won't get into the minutiae of it, but just to show you. The presumption is at the moment, if you have a bailiff to your door, there are vulnerable customer provisions that you can enact. And they're not that easy to do, but there are doing so, and we've improved them, and there's things called breathing space and lots of other things out there. But there are vulnerable culture provisions. But looking at our research, and again, this is mid-process and not final research, we're now looking, it now looks like substantially more than 50% of people whose doors bailiffs knock at have mental health problems, because the correlation is so strong. So should we actually be shifting that bias that we must assume if a bailiff is coming to your door, you have a mental health problem, and we automatically have those vulnerable customer considerations? Now, that is a seismic shift in the way that we operate policy in this country. The presumption at the moment is a presumption of no problem, but for certain categories within debt, actually the bias is wrong. And these are all great challenges. I mean, as much as the fact that it's one of the biggest causes, we've got two rabbis on here. You will know more, even though we're supposedly an affluent sector of society, you will know more than anyone else that marital disharmony, finance is a big, big part of it, right? It's one of the big causes of mental health breakdown, big cause of divorce, losing the roof over people's head. And I'm afraid, just to give you the stats, 400,000 people in England alone in 1 year considered taking their own lives due to debt. 100,000 people attempted it in 1 year. And that wasn't the pandemic year, that was the year before. So 100,000 people considered taking their own lives due to debts. So you bring that all together, and then you'll be staggered to know that when you go and do your NHS various forms of counselling, if you've got a mental health problem, they ask you about your marital situation, but previously they've never asked you about your finances. Now, our research shows potentially there's £5 billion of saving to the NHS if we have an automatic system of directing people who go for mental health counselling who've got financial problems, and we get the debt counsellors, not the mental health counsellors, to sort out their financial problems, and they're cheaper and more effective at the job. But at the moment, we have highly paid psychiatrists often sorting out people's debts for them because it's such an innate part of their mental health issue. So I say no one did this on purpose. But we've got to, I play golf and they always say you've got to get worse to get better. We've got a lot of deconstructing to do before the system works.
So I've got a million more questions, but as you said, there are two rabbis on the call, and I know a number of questions have been coming through to Rabbi Levin. So I am going to hand over to him now, but thank you so much. And there's so much more that we've got to learn. Rabbi Levin.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Lawrence, and thank you, Martin. Well, some of these questions may be getting a little bit close to the sorts of areas that you don't want to answer, but you let us know whether you're comfortable with them or not. You spoke about the tension, the paradox of thrift on the one hand, saving and supporting your family on the other hand, going out and spending. One of our viewers tonight asks, what do you feel will be the biggest pressures on consumers following Brexit and COVID?
I never thought I'd say this, but I think COVID dwarfs Brexit for once. COVID dwarfs for financially. Now, what's fascinating about what's happened over the last year is society split into four. There are four sectors of financial society. There are the people who were always doing well before and are still doing well now. There are people who were always doing badly before and are still doing badly now. There are the people who actually have done a lot better than they thought they would. There are many people out there who are now working from home, who were working before, or are even on furlough now, who, because their expenditure has dropped so substantially, have been able to save when they couldn't before. Two stats to back this up. I did a poll on Twitter. 59% of people told me they had more savings than a year ago at the start of the pandemic. 59%. The Bank of England records that there's 127 billion more being saved over the last year than normal because people aren't doing anything with their money and they're still earning. The other group is the group of people who were able to support themselves before and look after their families and have had no support, often known as the excluded. It's something I've been involved in campaigning, and whose finances have taken a catastrophic turn. So I was asked to sum up the budget the other day, and my glib summary to the budget is the people who've been helped will continue to be helped, and the people who haven't been helped will continue not to be helped. So you ask me what the stresses are. Well, for many people, their finances are better than they've ever been before right now, which is great and wonderful. Let's be happy. But there's a huge chunk of people who there is an absolute catastrophe going on. Small limited companies who've had absolutely no income, new starter self-employed, although some are going to get help, people whose companies, we subcontracted the welfare state out to companies to deliver the welfare state in the form of furlough. And some companies haven't behaved morally and have let their staff down. And therefore, through no fault of their own, their employees have not had any help, even though they were meant to look after the welfare state. Freelance PAYE in my own television industry who've struggled. Those people's finances are catastrophic. And the problem with catastrophic finances is they don't recover in a year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. They're life destructive, which is why I think, and I have said this, on the record at Treasury Committee, and I made it quite plain to the Chancellor last Thursday when I was interviewing him, I think this is very, very short-sighted, because what we have is people who are able to financially support themselves, contribute to society, contribute to paying taxes, who are not going to be able to do so and are going to become, and I use the word without any moral imperative, a burden on the state in the future, because we have destroyed them financially through the short-sightedness of not giving them support. So what are the stresses on families? For most families, the same as ever, except they've probably got a little bit more money. But for some families, they're going to be absolutely desperate, and we're going to add to the number of mortgage prisoners of people who can't move their mortgage and are paying too much. And unfortunately, we have a poverty premium in this country. The poorer you are, the more expensive stuff gets. Most of the discounts come by paying by direct debit or being on, or being able to get credit when you need it, or being able to pay for things with savings. As soon as you can't, everything gets more expensive. And so that's what I'm really worried about. I'm not worried about those families who've kept in work. They've got to do what they always did. Make sure you don't pay more for the stuff that you shouldn't pay more for, and do a decent budget and you'll be fine. It's all those people who, through no fault of their own, have lost absolutely everything due to this pandemic.
So this conversation with the Chancellor was a shot across the bow. You have run a number of very successful campaigns. You haven't won them all. The banking campaign wasn't one that you won at an earlier stage, but there are others that have been a lot.
I got £1 billion back for people, though. I count that as a relatively decent success. Is this another campaign? Well, I've been I'm supporting the campaign of the excluded group. I'm supporting that campaign. I've been vocal on it, and I was from way back. I think I wrote my first piece on it on early April, before people had started to spot the cracks. And I called them cracks then. I call them chasms now. Because you can forgive the government in making its decades worth of policies in days that there were gaps in the system. Of course, they did a brilliant job in the early days of getting furlough and self-employment grants up and running at such speed. And I applauded them then, and I still laud them now for it. The inflexibility since is the problem. And I think that stems from two or maybe three issues. In some cases, it's a principled objection, such as to supporting limited company directors. For me, you can have your arguments about how much tax people pay. So fix the tax system, but support them meantime in the midst of the worst pandemic for a century. There are some practical problems. The Chancellor got a kicking from the National Audit Office about fraud, and I think is concerned of getting another one. I think, frankly, there's enough fraud out there, but I'd prefer to take a bit of fraud and save these people's lives and finances. And I think the third one is I think they all thought it was going to get better last summer and they wouldn't need it again. So they stopped focusing on how they could fix support. Everything reverted and turned around at such great speed that all they could do is say, we're going to do what we did before, because they hadn't put the thought and the time into getting it fixed. Is it a campaign? Yes. Will we win it? I've had small wins. We got 2019-20 tax returns into the self-employed grant, this 600,000 people. In the early days of furlough, I got them to agree to allow people who had left jobs and the jobs had fallen through to be able to be rehired and furloughed. That was about 50,000 people we managed to save there. Will we win the big ones? No. No. And in fact, someone accused me of not getting an answer from the Chancellor about limited companies the other day. I disagree. I said to him, is the door firmly shut now? They won't get any more support. And he said, yes, it's an answer. I don't like the answer.
Just the answer happens to be no. On the subject of fraud, here's a very sad question. My wife and I have been the unfortunate victims of a local scammer. We lost our entire savings. Discovered that this person had been banned as a company director. The house he lives in is in his partner's name. What can we do? Our money is gone and we've lost everything.
I wish that was the first time I'd heard a question like that, rather than it being a couple of times a week.
Well, if you've heard it before, you'll surely have the answer then.
I don't have the answer because we don't have the situation. It depends. Look, if it was a push payment, if you paid through your bank, there is push payment protection. where you can go to the bank, and depending on the level of negligence, and it has to be extremely negligent for you not to be paid out, you may be entitled to money back from the bank. The bank will probably reject you on that. It is an absolute banking lottery whether they accept or reject you, but substantially over 50% of cases that go onto the financial ombudsman of push payment fraud are upheld by the ombudsman. So the banks are being overturned on that basis. So I'd urge you to complain and talk to your bank and then take a case to the financial ombudsman. If it wasn't a payment via the bank, it gets much more difficult. Some people may know I sued Facebook a couple of years ago for scams involving my face on them. As part of the settlement, I got them to donate £3 million to set up an organisation called Citizens Advice Scam Action, which can give one-on-one help for people who've been scammed. I would urge, and we won't mention these people's names, I would urge the couple, it seemed to be, go and talk to Citizens Advice Scam Action. I'm not promising they will get you your money back, but they will at least talk through what happened to you, and you'll be able to make an appointment, and they may be able to put you on some form of path to something.
Here's a question which must surely be concerning many people who would be on this call and others beyond as well. And it's about long-term care, funding in later life, the concern that we'll live for a long time, that we'll become, God forbid, ill to the point where we're unable to take care of ourselves, and the huge outlay of money that will be required either to be able to go into a home or to be able to have home care without the social services support, and the terrible concern that one will use up one's savings before one has died, or not have any opportunity to pass on any savings to one's children for which one has worked so hard throughout one's life. What is your view about the long-term care provision in this country, and what should we be campaigning for?
It's not a specific subject area of mine. It's not an expertise of mine. And I always like to be honest when I know something and when I don't. So I'll answer as an interested generalist rather than as an expert or specialist. Clearly, we have a nightmare with our position on long-term care because we haven't had a position. We've had so many commissions and reports into what should be done, and no government has yet had the chutzpah or nous to get this sorted, and we need this to be done on a long-term cross-party basis, and it has not been solved, which means we have a pig's ear. Now, there is only one bit, Shlomo, in your question that I might disagree with somewhat, which is I'm not sure it is such a tragedy to have used up all your savings on yourself before you die. I think those are your savings. My hope is, we live typically 85 years. We work 45 years. The first 20 years of our life are paid for by our parents, and we will then pay for our children. So there's a cross-generational subsidy there. My parents paid for me when I was young. I pay for my daughter when she's young. So that's the first 20 years I've got to pay for. The other 20 years is at the other end, once I've retired, that I have to pay for on average. And that's my responsibility. And my hope is that the first thing people will do is give their children the education, the information, the moral values and the nous to be able to go on and support themselves. There are some cases where they can't do that. And that I would hope is a duty as a parent. To continue to support them once you've given them that throughout your life to the sacrifice of your own standard of living, I would argue is not necessarily the duty of a parent once they are fully capable and of adult age. And I have this at student finance, how do I repay my child's student loan? Well, you don't. They'll repay it if they earn enough. And you don't, it's not your obligation to do so. So I think there is a discussion in this country to be had about inheritance. And actually one of my great worries about pension freedom, when we had pension freedom in this country, is that the tabloids worried about you've got freedom to spend your pension in one go, people will go out and buy Ferraris. I actually worried that we're a risk-averse nation. And so what we'll do is be far too frugal in the early years of our retirement and keep all the money aside to give to our children and live in penury for most of our retirement because we now have the freedom to not spend our money. Whereas on an annuity, you didn't have that freedom.
It sounds to me like you are advocating skiing, skiing, spending the kids' inheritance.
I'm advocating, there's nothing wrong with leaving your kids money. But I think there's a danger for leaving them too much, right? And there's also a danger of leaving promoting leaving your kids' money over your own natural, normal standard of living. That's where I think it's dangerous. If you have enough that you can support them and continue to live in the style and standard that you'd want in your old age, then great for you. If not, then look after yourselves. As long as your kids are capable, you know, you might have a child with a mental capacity issue or a mental health issue or something else that they need support. But in the normal scheme of things, I do think in your old age, your money's for you and you need to look after yourself first. My dad is on the call. He'll probably disagree with me. But yeah, I don't want it, Dad. You carry on.
But it is a strong instinct, isn't it? It's a strong instinct of parents to want to be able to support their children throughout their parents' lives and beyond as well. But thank you for that. The next questions are a little bit more specific, and here's a couple who are making aliyah. They're just wondering whether, and this might be specific financial advice, which we've already said you prefer not to answer, but should people sell property they own or rent it out instead? What is the better way to go in the current financial climate?
Well, I think what would be very helpful for Rabbi, if you would probably be better at this than me. Do you know where I can find a cheap crystal ball?
Yes, you'll find one in Southampton Synagogue every Shabbat morning, and if you haven't found it yet, there must be some problem somewhere.
I've not been able to come due to COVID. I think that's the issue.
I know that. By the way,
the answer there is one of the great things we have to teach people in life is there is no certainty. There is no certainty. I'll do it. You're far too wise to play this game with, but if you could drop your IQ points by about 20 with me, it'll work a lot better if you just pretend for a moment. So if I offered all of you out there, I can see numbers of you. I won't tell you who I can see on my screen. If I offered you this bet, pretend I've got a real coin in my hand, I haven't. That's not the trick. There's no trick to this. So the bet's this. We'll do a heads or tail toss of the coin. If you win, I will give you £100. If I win, you only have to give me £1. Is that a good bet? No trick. Toss of a perfectly fair coin. If I toss it, you win, I give you £100. I win, you have to give me £1. Would you take that bet, Rabbi?
Yeah.
Yes. Everybody else, can I see nods out there? I can look at some of you. Yes, you're nodding. It's a good bet. So let's toss the coin. If you would call Shlomo for me, heads or tails?
Heads.
It's tails. Was it a bad bet?
Not especially. It only cost me £1.
It wasn't a bad bet. It was a bad outcome. You made a good decision. You had a bad outcome. And people confuse the two. A good decision is all you can do. Now, it's very easy to understand on a 50-50 bet when I'm giving you 100 to 1 on it, that it's a good bet, but a bad outcome. When it's, should I fix my mortgage? Should I sell my house or rent? We don't use that logic. The logic we use is we try and predict because we think it's much more fine. I mean, other similar questions. Should I fix my mortgage? Should I fix my gas and electricity? Should I marry him or her? All of those are uncertainties that you will never, ever know the answer to in advance. So you have to make the decision based on the available information that you have at the time. And then on the back end of that, don't confuse a bad outcome with a bad decision. Many people fixed their mortgage in 2007 because they wanted long-term rate surety, and then rates crumpled and they went, I made the worst decision. You didn't. You wanted long-term rate security. You got it. You fixed your mortgage. You had a bad outcome. The problem with confusing the two is we make bad decisions in future. If we think it was a bad decision and we change the way we behave based on something that you had no control. So should I sell or should I rent it out? Well, renting has risk. You might not have a tenant. The cost might be bigger than you think. You're probably renting in London that'll give you a 3% yield, which isn't that good. Renting is always a risk. Then again, if you sell, what rate are you going to convert the currency? If you take the money to Israel with you, will the rate get better or worse there? Are you going to be able to make any money on that? There is no right answer. Ultimately, this is a question of speculation. So actually, my answer goes back to make a good decision that's sensible, that's right for you, and don't look back in hindsight on it. Do whichever you feel more comfortable with. Don't feel forced into taking a risk if you don't need to. Who's going to manage the property for you? We're going to pay someone to do it. Can you cope with the hassle of doing it yourself? Do you have the experience to do that? Are you in a good area? There are lots of different. It's not a yes or no answer. But I have, when I do my roadshows on telly, people come up to me and there are some questions where they want information and there are some where they want permission. And they're actually just saying, this is what I think I should do. Should I do it? I'm sure you get the same thing, right? And my answer to that question is neither one is wrong. Neither one is wrong. So don't worry too much.
But aren't there situations such as a few years ago in Money Saving Expert when in relation to utilities, you believed that the new contracts that were going to come out were going to be have a price hike, and you were recommending to people to actually not go into fixed term contracts, but rather to wait upon the prices dropping for contracts which weren't capped? Aren't there times when you are actually advising people one way or the other in these bets?
So look, there are certain areas where you can have a crystal ball maybe 1 or 2 or 3 months ahead. So on, you can look at the running path of wholesale prices on energy, and the buying strategies. So that's a little bit of market insight, right? Where you can then tell people how it's going to work. And, and I will often say, generally, and we shouldn't say, if I say on television, I think there might be another account of that coming out next week. It might even be better. That means I know there's another account coming out next week. I'm not allowed to tell you about it, but I'm trying to give you all I'm allowed within the constraints of the information I have. So I do perhaps have, through industry expertise and being tipped off a lot, I do maybe have a crystal ball for a month or two, but very rarely much longer than that.
Here's a thorny question, and it's about the tax avoidance by large international corporates, tech companies and others. And the reason why it's thorny, because on the one hand, it feels completely unfair that they should not be contributing in an equal way to the economy and to the coffers of the exchequer. On the other hand, it probably is to our benefit as consumers that they pay less tax, because if they're going to pay more tax, it'll be passed on to us. So the question from someone who's viewing this Zoom tonight is, what do you think about government policy? What do you think should be done about these companies? What's your position in this regard?
Well, we've always had a debate up whether money saving experts should include tax avoidance tips. So of course, now most people say there are 2 types. There's tax evasion, which is where you illegally don't pay tax, and there's tax avoidance where you legally don't pay tax. Personally, I believe there are 3 categories. There's tax evasion, tax avoidance, and tax planning. Now, I do tax planning. A money saving expert talks about tax planning. Tax planning is where you do something that you are being encouraged to do by the government for a tax incentive. An ISA is encouraging you to save in it, and it's tax-free. A pension is encouraging you to put money away for your future, and therefore there's tax benefits. An enterprise investment scheme is encouraging you to invest in smaller type of companies, and there are tax benefits. That's legitimate tax planning. It's behavioral push economics with a tax incentive. The difference between that and tax avoidance is you're doing something that isn't intended, and you're manipulating a situation to get a tax gain, but not to do a recommended behavior is how I differentiate between the 2. Now, the problem we have internationally, as many people out there will know more than I do, is that these are international companies, and therefore the UK unilaterally would struggle to make regulation. I know that the Chancellor is looking at it. He's said it. I think perhaps we should do so. The cost would be passed on to the consumer. But while we are all consumers, every consumer in this country is also a citizen, or at least a resident. And ultimately, the money that is not going in taxation, it is money that would be redistributed along the grounds of greatest need, where I'm not sure that the amount that we save on our Amazon shopping is necessarily redistributed along the grounds of greatest need. Okay, as a proportion of our income, the richer you are, the less you spend. But of the amount of our spending we do, the richer you are, the more you spend at Amazon. And we're all spending at Amazon. And in fact, it's interesting how many people hate Amazon, but then go and buy it. That's our instant place that we go and buy and do our spending on it. So I would argue we do need those companies to pay tax properly. And we need them to pay tax fairly. They're paying it properly. We need them to pay their fair share of tax. We need that because that revenue should come through to the exchequer, so it should be redistributed. We need that because those huge, overly powerful American countries are perverting our high streets and our shopping with an unfair advantage over companies that pay all their taxes here, that have all their staff here, and that are homegrown countries. And I've got nothing against international companies, but when we take giant international companies and we give them an inbuilt advantage against our homegrown companies, it's the opposite of tariffs. You know, we have positive tariffs for the big international companies in comparison to our own companies. So I think the sooner the world disempowers those giant companies a little bit and starts taxing them properly. I mean, Mr. Bezos, he's done very well. I'm sure he could cope with paying a little bit of tax.
Well, he's done moderately well, only moderately well.
He's done all right. Listen, that's not what you would say if he was speaking now and you were hoping for a donation for the shul. Come on.
But here's the last question, and then I have one which I'd like to ask as well to end this evening. But it's about some of the disadvantages to us, the consumers, in terms of purchasing from abroad and from some of these companies. When we order online nowadays, there are hidden import duties, VAT, etc. And it's sometimes very hard for us. It's not transparent. It's very hard for us to see actually what we're getting ourselves into. How can we, the question over here is, how can we avoid this situation of these hidden charges of which we were unaware at the time that we placed the order from abroad?
Well, generally, if you're buying something, first of all, not everybody knows they're buying from abroad. So if you're buying on a marketplace like Amazon and eBay, you may be buying from abroad unaware, which is very difficult. And we've always had problems with that, even before the import duties, because if you want to return it, you suddenly find you're having to pay 50 quid postage for a £30 pair of sneakers, which gets very frustrating. So the answer at the moment on the tariffs, though, is generally 150 quid from memory. That's a few weeks ago I last did that. Is under 150 quid, you should be fine. Over 150 quid, you may have to pay both duty and import taxes and then fees to the company, because it has to do the administration on the back of that. And it can be very, very expensive. I mean, there are checks that you can do, which is when you're buying, you need to check whether you've been charged VAT by the company directly. If you have, you shouldn't be double charged it when it comes here. If you haven't, you need to expect that you're going to have to pay it. The costs haven't in many ways actually increased, barring the administration costs. They've just become less transparent. So therefore, when we make a purchasing decision, we're not aware. So obvious checks, if you're buying from a marketplace, always check to see if it's coming from abroad. And abroad now means anywhere apart from the UK. It's not, France is abroad. It didn't used to be. It's now abroad. So do those checks, especially if it's over 150 quid. If it is from abroad, then check for whether you paid VAT. There may still be customs duty, but if you've paid the VAT, that's normally the big one that makes it a little bit easier. But we need better systems in place, and I would add regulation on the companies that are selling for abroad to notify this. There are many other things I'd add regulation on, such as you don't always get the Section 75 protection due to the way your payment is processed. But even I don't know when that happens and when that doesn't happen, because the companies themselves don't know. Even the Ombudsman can't tell me. It's on a case-by-case basis. And I think we need, now we're all transacting online more, I think we need some more regulation so we understand our rights before we buy a bit more. That will be one of the things we're campaigning on.
Plenty more work to do. Yeah. I have a question, if you don't mind, and it's a slightly more personal one with which we're going to end this evening. You alluded to the fact a little bit earlier, that you were slightly more aggressive when you started. Your slogans have changed slightly and been modified. You've been in this for quite a long time. You have been enormously successful, as Rabbi Lawrence described in his introduction. Apart from the external issues of fame and being scammed by Facebook, on Facebook and other places, what have you learned? How's this changed you? What have you learned about people? What have you learned about yourself? What have you learned about the citizenship of the United Kingdom? And in what way has it modified your entire outlook about consumerism and the way in which the attitudes that we should have towards wealth, towards saving, etc., but the personal lessons that you have learned from this journey that you've been on?
So there are many. I alluded to one earlier, which was when I started, I was very much a purist. It's your job to beat the system and you can do it. And I had an epiphany moment. And you know, you take them on and you can win. This is survival of the fittest, financial survival of the fittest and the brightest. And you'd ask me if you were doing this interview 20 years ago, that would have been my attitude. And then I met someone, a friend of a friend, who said, I love your website. I said, really, why? This was in the early days. And they said, oh, I use it all the time. I said, have you saved much? I said, I don't use it for me. I'm a mental health caseworker. And I spend most of my time helping my clients on it. And that was eye-opening. And then I had some dark times of my own, as many of us do. Mental health isn't always clinical. It's a sine wave. You go up and down. And I realized, I got to an age where I realized my own vulnerabilities and that I wasn't Superman and I'd always been a clever boy who could do what I wanted. And I realized actually there are stresses and things that are very difficult to deal with in life. And I was very lucky at the time that I had the finances in place to be able to help, to look after myself when I really, you know, I went through a time where I didn't want to get out of bed in the morning and it was tough to do so. The lady watching there was wonderful. And, oh, you got me there. Right, let's carry on. And so I learned that lack of superhuman nature and actually became, I think, a much more compassionate individual on the back of it, realizing that we all have failings. None of us are as strong as we think we are. And we all need that help within our community, in our society, in our country, to be able to help each other. So I think that was one of the lessons. And the other lesson I would probably put about that I learned myself is it's very easy to believe that you're successful because you're the shizzle, right? You are it. You are absolutely the dog's whatever. And I don't believe that. I believe there are many people with talent and there are many people who work hard, and I've worked very, very hard. And there are many people with focus, and I've been very, very focused. But I got the luck. I got the luck that put me in this extreme position of earning more money than I would have ever dreamed of. That wasn't my aspiration. And having the fame that I would never have dreamed of, and, you know, most trusted and all those other accolades that come with it. And I think that when you've got to accept that you have luck. And when you accept that you have luck, then you have a responsibility to acknowledge that you're the lucky one and to give back. Because I won that sort of vocational jackpot and most people didn't. And that's part of the giving back. And then the final one I learned as a country, well, actually, it's interesting. You might see this as a negative one. I don't. I think it's an obvious one. And I think actually it's something that we all need to learn to understand when it comes to money anyway. When I teach my young writers and they write something, they will often write something that says, 2 million people are owed the marriage tax allowance and haven't claimed it. And I put a big red line through that. And I write, are you one of 2 million people who are owed the marriage tax allowance and who haven't claimed it? Because the first thing that we all are is selfish individuals. And I don't say that in a pejorative way, but we have to appeal to the individual. The thing that makes you act most is self-interest. And it's a luxury to be selfless. And when I write, everything I write and the way I communicate is always, and I got slated for it when I started in personal finance, along as many other things I did differently. I always wrote in I and you. I think this and you should do that, rather than they, because it's not about they, it's always about you. And you trust me, so I'm an I. And I think that selfishness and understanding that mindset is very important. But if I turn it back and turn it back around with perhaps something more fitting to the forum that we're in, I have an extremely wealthy friend. I won't mention them, and they're not a member of the tribe, which makes life easier as well. An extremely wealthy, dwarfs me a lot. And this is an individual who I would go on about giving to charity. And she challenged me and said to me, I don't get charity. This is someone worth enormous amounts of money. I don't get charity. I've never given to charity. Not a religious person in any way. And he said, I don't get what's in it for me. And I said, I'm going to come back to you on that one. And I went back and I said, giving to charity is the most selfish thing that you can ever do. You can go about and you can see all these people with smiling faces, their lives have been improved, and you get to go, I did that. Now, he's never given that much, just a few million, which for I've said him now, him stroke her, which for him is a drop in the ocean. But selfishness isn't always bad. I think wanting to put others down and to hurt and to make other people not succeed isn't always bad. But there is something, I go back to it, that the selfishness of looking after yourself first, and the selfishness in my position of feeling good by being able to choose why I get out of bed in the morning and what activities I undertake, actually is not a bad driving force. And we perhaps all need to understand it a little bit more.
Well, I'll turn that one around as well, because the reason why I asked you this last question was because when I read about the amount of charity that you yourself have given in a personal sense, and the way in which charity is embedded in the structure of your company, and that a proportion, of the profits go to good cause and to help people in financial difficulty, etc. I asked myself the question, what is the driver for this man? What is that actually lies behind all of this? And in this very honest answer that you've given us a few moments ago, and all the way through the answer, I think we have found the answer to my question. Being in this business, which one would have thought is all about brutal battle for the consumer against the big guys and against companies, actually, it seems to me that what has happened is that in this journey that you've taken, you have actually become a deeply, deeply compassionate and caring human being. Forget about the selfishness. It's actually about the giving and about the sharing and the wanting to do good. And that is really what has been so enormously, enormously impressive about tonight's interview, and particularly the honesty of your last answer. So Martin, thank you so much for that. And thank you all for joining us tonight in what has been a really fascinating interview. Thank you, Rabbi Lawrence, for your excellent questions with which you started. And thank you all for the questions that you asked subsequently. But most of all, thank you, Martin, for being the person that you are, really inspirational for the human qualities that you have brought to what could simply be a commercial enterprise, but it is something so much deeper, so much bigger, and so much more meaningful than any of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.